In the summer of 1855, when the air along the Red River clung to skin like damp linen, a single candle burned late inside a plantation house that pretended to sleep. The flame bent and straightened with each breath of warm night air, throwing soft shadows across white walls and polished furniture. Outside, cicadas cried without pause, as if warning the house that silence could never fully be kept. Inside, a leather-bound ledger lay open on a desk, its pages swollen from years of ink and secrecy, its columns neat, deliberate, unforgiving. The house itself looked respectable from a distance. Tall white columns, fresh paint, shutters closed just enough to suggest order. It was the kind of place people pointed to when they spoke of stability and lineage. But beneath that appearance, behind locked drawers and measured smiles, lived records that told a different story. The ledgers were not family histories. They were not journals of love or growth. They were counts, tallies, proof that human lives could be reduced to entries and margins when it served power well enough. It was in one of those ledgers that her name appeared for the first time in a way that mattered. Not written with affection, not written with pride, just a line of ink placed beside a word that would follow her like a shadow. She was 17 years old when someone decided she was unfit. The pen did not shake when it wrote it. The hand was steady. The judgment was calm. Unfit to marry, unfit to protect the family name, unfit to remain visible in a house that valued reputation more than blood. No record explains who first spoke the word aloud. It could have been her father sitting stiff-backed at that same desk, staring at figures instead of his child. It could have been men from the church, voices low and serious, speaking of propriety as if it were holy law. Or it could have been no single person at all, just the slow cruelty of a society that trained itself to see women as reflections of male honor rather than as people. In that world, obedience was worth more than truth, and silence was mistaken for virtue. The accusation did not arrive openly. It did not knock at the door in daylight. It came folded inside a letter sealed with wax passed quietly from hand to hand. Rumor dressed as concern, suspicion disguised as guidance. There was no trial. No chance to speak. No moment where her voice was invited into the room. Once the word was written, it was treated as fact. Ink had a way of hardening into certainty. As days passed, the house grew smaller around her. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped when she entered. Her presence felt inconvenient, as if the walls themselves were embarrassed by her. Each evening, she took the same seat near the front window, watching the road that cut through the fields and disappeared toward the river. Wagons rolled by, horses passed. Carriages carried strangers who would never know her name. Life moved forward just beyond the glass, indifferent to what was unfolding inside. Inside the house, her future began to shrink. What had once been wide and undefined narrowed to a few careful sentences spoken in low voices. Plans were no longer discussed in front of her. When her father spoke, it was not to her. It was to men who arrived with papers and questions. They asked her age with professional interest. They asked about her health. They spoke the way merchants speak when weighing goods, their eyes trained not on her face but on what she represented. Her father avoided her gaze. When their paths crossed in hallways, he looked past her shoulder or down at the floor as if acknowledging her might undo the story he was telling himself. He spoke of necessity when he spoke at all, of how the world worked, of what had to be done. His words were careful and practiced, but they carried no warmth. Whatever conflict lived inside him was buried beneath the weight of his own reputation. At night, when the house finally settled and the lamps were turned low, she could hear movement downstairs, the scratch of a chair against wood, the soft tap of a pen against paper, the sound of pages being turned slowly, deliberately. On one of those nights, a candle burned long after the others were extinguished. Wax dripped onto the desk. Ink was poured. A signature was added to the ledger with the same calm precision that marked every other entry. That signature mattered more than any word spoken aloud. It made the judgment permanent. It transformed suspicion into action. Ink dried, sealing a decision that could not be undone. In that moment, the house chose order over justice, image over innocence. The decision would echo long after the candle burned down, long after the man who signed it was gone. By morning, no one explained anything to her directly. No announcement was made. No confrontation occurred. She understood what was happening the way people often do in places where silence rules, through absence, through averted eyes, through the sudden finality in her father's movements. Silence settled over the house like a verdict, and she felt its weight pressed down on her chest. Breakfast passed quietly. Chairs scraped the floor, plates clinked, but no one spoke her name. Servants moved more carefully around her, their eyes filled with something between pity and fear. They knew better than to ask questions. In houses like that, curiosity was dangerous. Silence was survival. She returned to the window as she had the night before. The road looked the same. Dust rose beneath passing wheels. The world showed no sign that anything had changed. Yet everything had. The house that once defined her now felt like a place she was already being erased from. Her childhood ended not with an argument or a farewell, but with a quiet understanding that her place had been decided without her consent. Somewhere downstairs, the ledger was closed and locked away. Its pages held more than numbers. They held intent. They held a story that would be told one way for years to come, stripped of context and consequence. What they did not hold was her voice. That remained unrecorded, left to exist only in memory and breath. As the sun climbed higher over the river, heat settled into the walls. The house resumed its appearance of calm respectability. Anyone passing by would have seen nothing unusual. No sign of rupture, no evidence of betrayal, just a family estate carrying on as it always had. But inside, a truth had already taken shape, not written in ink this time, but felt in the spaces between words. She knew then that whatever came next was no longer hers to control. The judgment had been made. The silence had spoken. And in that house, silence had always meant that guilt was no longer questioned, only enforced. In Antebellum, Louisiana, reputation carried more weight than acres of land or rows of crops, and men guarded it with a devotion that bordered on fear. A good name could open doors, secure marriages, protect wealth, and silence questions. A damaged one could undo generations. Her father understood this well. He was known in his parish as a respectable man, the kind whose pew was never empty on Sundays, whose nod carried quiet authority, whose word was trusted without being tested. People spoke of him with approval, as if his discipline and order were signs of moral clarity. But respectability, when it feels threatened, does not soften. It sharpens. It turns inward and begins to cut. Months before the decision was made, whispers had already begun to move through the spaces he could not control. They were small at first, barely formed. A glance held a moment too long during a visit, a walk taken without asking permission, a pause in conversation that lingered just long enough to invite imagination. Nothing criminal, nothing proven, nothing that would survive daylight. But in a society built on rigid hierarchy, suspicion did not need proof to be dangerous. It only needed repetition. Each whisper carried the same quiet implication, and with every retelling it grew heavier. House began to feel the strain before anyone spoke openly. The air changed. Conversations tightened. Her father listened without responding, his face unreadable, his hands steady. Inside him, calculation had already begun. He did not ask her what was true. He did not seek clarity. In his world, truth was less important than control. To defend her would require him to question the system that gave him power, and that was a risk he would not take. Preservation became his guiding principle. His standing mattered more than her voice. When he finally spoke of the matter, he did so in careful language. He spoke of necessity, of arrangements, of what society demanded. His words sounded reasonable to those who shared his fears, but beneath them lived something smaller and more fragile. Fear that her presence, her youth, her independence would unravel the image he had spent a lifetime constructing. Fear that people would look at him differently. Fear that silence would no longer be enough. Servants noticed the change long before any decision was announced. Doors that had once remained open were now closed. Meals were taken at different times. Her chair at the table was left empty more often than not. Her name stopped appearing in casual conversation, as if saying it aloud might give weight to the rumors. She felt herself becoming something fragile, something inconvenient, something that had to be handled carefully or removed entirely. When the trader arrived, there was no shock in his expression. He did not hesitate. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He had seen this pattern before. Fathers who spoke of correction, of discipline, of saving a daughter from herself. He understood what those words really meant. The meeting was brief, businesslike. Papers were placed on the desk. Figures were discussed quietly. The ledger was opened, its pages ready to absorb another life reduced to ink. The transaction moved quickly, efficiently, as if speed itself could lessen the weight of what was being done. The ledger recorded the exchange without emotion. No mention of the way her hands trembled when she realized the truth. No record of the breath she held to keep from crying. No space for protest, because protest was never expected. When she was told she was being sent away, the explanation was wrapped in concern. It was for her own good. Obedience would redeem her. Distance would restore order. These words were delivered calmly, as if kindness lived inside them. But redemption in that world was not freely given to women already marked by suspicion. It was something promised but rarely delivered, always just out of reach. She did not scream. She did not argue. The house had already taught her what resistance would cost. Instead, she packed what she was allowed to take, each item a reminder of how little space she was permitted to occupy. The morning the carriage arrived, the house looked exactly as it always had. Clean walls, polished floors, calm faces. From the outside, nothing appeared disturbed. As she stepped inside the carriage, she looked back once, searching for something that might signal regret or doubt. The house offered nothing. It stood firm, respectable, unchanged. Its secrets remained sealed within its walls. As the wheels turned and the road carried her away, dust rose behind her, slowly settling back onto the path as if erasing her departure. The injustice did not announce itself with raised voices or violence. It did not demand attention. It moved quietly, confident in its protection, confident that no one would challenge it. The house behind her would continue to host visitors. Her father would continue to sit in his pew. The ledger would remain locked away, its pages intact. And for a time, it would seem as though the decision had solved the problem. But injustice that settles quietly does not disappear. It waits. It buries itself beneath routine and respectability, certain that memory will fade. As the carriage disappeared down the road, the silence left behind grew thicker, heavier, pressing against the walls that had witnessed everything and said nothing at all. Years later, long after the war had torn through Louisiana and burned away the old certainties men once relied on, the plantation no longer carried the confidence it once displayed. Its white paint had peeled into thin strips. Moss claimed the columns it once framed with pride. Floors sagged where footsteps no longer passed. The house stood in quiet surrender, holding its breath beneath years of dust and abandonment, as if waiting for something it knew could not remain buried forever. It was during a routine repair, meant only to keep the structure from collapsing entirely, that a worker pried loose a warped floorboard near what had once been a private study. The wood came up with a dry groan, releasing a smell of damp earth and age, and beneath it lay something small and folded, protected only by darkness and neglect. A letter, yellowed at the edges, creased carefully, never sent. The paper was brittle, thin from time, but the ink remained clear enough to read, each line written in a careful, disciplined hand, the kind trained not to wander, not to reveal more than necessary. It was hers. There was no name signed boldly at the bottom, no plea for recognition. The letter did not beg to be believed. It did not accuse anyone directly. It simply recorded what had happened, as if setting facts down was the last form of control she had left. She wrote of the night the whispers began, the way voices lowered when she entered a room, the way concern disguised itself as judgment. She named the men who spoke first, not with anger, but with precision, as if she understood that accuracy mattered more than emotion. She described her father's silence, the way his eyes avoided hers, the way his words shifted from affection to distance without explanation. There was no dramatics in her writing, no attempt to persuade. She did not argue her innocence. She stated it quietly, not as a defense, but as a truth she needed to leave behind. Line by line, she documented how suspicion hardened into certainty without proof, how a reputation was protected by sacrifice, how her voice was never invited into the room where her future was decided. The tone of the letter remained steady, almost restrained, as if she knew that outrage would only weaken its purpose. She wrote as someone who understood that this document would likely never be read in time to save her, but might one day matter to someone else. Near the end, the handwriting shifted slightly. Not from fear, not from panic, but from exhaustion. The letters leaned closer together as if space itself was running out. She mentioned illness briefly, the way one might note a change in weather without complaint. She spoke of fading strength, of days that blurred together, of places where names were forgotten easily and people disappeared quietly. By the time the letter was finished, she already seemed aware that her story would not follow her. She folded the paper carefully, hiding it beneath the floorboard not as a dramatic act, but as a final attempt to anchor truth somewhere solid. Then she was gone. No marker recorded where she died. No ceremony marked her passing. Illness claimed her in a place where many were already invisible, where suffering left little trace. The ledger that had sealed her fate never mentioned her again. The house returned to its routines. Her father's name remained intact, spoken with respect, shielded by silence and time. But the letter endured. It waited through war, decay, abandonment. It listened as the house emptied and aged, as walls cracked and floors bowed. When it was finally uncovered and read aloud years later, its impact was quiet but irreversible. Those who listened did not gasp. They did not argue. They felt something shift instead, a slow realignment of memory and meaning. The plantation no longer appeared dignified. Its history no longer seemed orderly. The respectability that once surrounded her father now looked fragile, constructed carefully around omission and fear. The ledger that once appeared authoritative suddenly felt incomplete, its neat columns exposed as selective truths. The letter revealed what the records never would. There had been no scandal, no moral failure, no crime that demanded punishment, only fear, only a man unwilling to risk his standing for his child. The power imbalance that had shaped her fate stood clearly exposed, stripped of justification. As the letter passed from hand to hand, its words remained unchanged, but the space around them transformed. What had once been dismissed as rumor now collapsed under the weight of clarity. What had been framed as necessity now appeared as cowardice. The truth did not arrive loudly. It did not demand apology or retribution. It stood quietly, undeniable, reshaping how the past was understood. The house itself seemed altered by the knowledge, its silence heavier now, its emptiness more intentional. Truth had waited patiently beneath wood and dust, confident in time. It always does. And when it rises, it does not shout. It does not seek revenge. It simply exists, steady and unmoving, asking only to be acknowledged, leaving behind a question that lingers long after the words are read, about how many other stories remain hidden and how long they too are willing to wait. The plantation did not collapse all at once. It surrendered slowly, year by year, season by season, as vines climbed its walls and roots pushed through its foundations. What had once been a place of order and authority became a quiet ruin, reclaimed by heat, rain, and forgetting. Locals passing by said the air around it felt heavier than elsewhere, as if the land itself remembered what the walls refused to confess. Moss hung thick from the columns, softening their sharp lines, blurring the image of respectability they once projected. Windows stood dark and empty, reflecting nothing but sky and shadow. At dusk, when light faded unevenly through the trees, some claimed they heard footsteps where no one walked. Others dismissed it as wind moving through broken boards. History, after all, rarely needs ghosts to make its point. It leaves impressions instead, subtle and persistent, felt more than seen. The house became a place people spoke about quietly, without certainty, as if unsure whether memory itself might overhear. Long after the letter was discovered beneath the floorboard, it traveled carefully, passed from hand to hand with a restraint that matched its tone. It did not appear in headlines or sermons. It found its way into an archive first, catalogued gently, given a number instead of a name. Paper met paper. Ink met dust. There it rested among records of births and deaths, property transfers and wills, surrounded by documents that had shaped lives without ever describing them. Over time, the letter slipped into quiet conversation. A historian mentioned it in passing. A local teacher shared its story with a small class. Her name, once erased deliberately, began to be spoken again, this time without embarrassment or warning. It did not return loudly. It returned carefully, as if people sensed that speaking it too forcefully might do further harm. With each telling, the shape of the past shifted slightly. The plantation was no longer remembered solely as a symbol of stability or tradition. It became a place where silence had been used as a tool, where reputation had been preserved at a cost that was finally acknowledged. The father's legacy did not vanish, but it changed. He was no longer recalled primarily for his standing or discipline. He became known instead for what he surrendered to protect that standing. The omission that once shielded him now defined him. There was no trial to reopen. No court to convene. No punishment waiting patiently across decades. The law had already moved on, uninterested in revisiting what had been quietly accepted at the time. But remembrance itself became a form of justice. The truth altered how stories were told in that region, how the house was described, how silence was interpreted. What had once been seen as propriety was now understood as avoidance. What had once been dismissed as rumor was recognized as warning. People began to speak more carefully about the past, aware that absence in records did not mean absence of harm. In church archives, among brittle pages and faded ink, her name appeared again. It had always been there, but now it carried an addition. Next to it, written in a different hand, long after the original entry, was a single word. Wronged. It was small, Incomplete, it did not explain what had happened or undo it, but it mattered. It acknowledged imbalance. It recognized injustice without embellishment. It was a quiet correction, offered too late to save her, but not too late to matter. That word changed how the record was read. It introduced discomfort where there had once been certainty. Visitors who saw it paused longer than expected, their fingers hovering just above the page, as if unsure whether they were permitted to feel something for a person they had never known. The plantation itself became part of local memory rather than local pride. Parents warned children not about ghosts, but about silence, about what happens when people choose comfort over truth. The house stood as a reminder not of horror, but of restraint taken too far, of decisions made quietly that echoed loudly across time. Even those who insisted nothing unusual had happened there spoke with less confidence than before. The letter had unsettled something permanent. It had introduced doubt into places where certainty once lived comfortably. History does not absolve easily. It does not rush to forgive. It watches. It waits. It allows stories to settle into myth before pulling gently at their edges. When enough light reaches what was buried, it does not erase the past. It reshapes it. It forces names to carry their full weight, not just the parts people prefer to remember. Some names are lifted onto monuments, carved into stone, protected by ceremony. Others survive only in fragile paper, folded and hidden, waiting to be found. But all names eventually find their gravity. All stories, given time, push upward through the layers meant to suppress them. The plantation still stands, though changed, quieter, stripped of authority. The land has absorbed its certainty, leaving behind only structure and shadow. Those who walk past it today do so with awareness, sensing that memory lingers even when voices fade. The silence there feels different now, heavier, more intentional. It is no longer empty. It is filled with what was once denied. And somewhere between the vines and the records, between the ruined house and the archive shelves, a balance has shifted slightly toward truth. Some names, at last, find peace. But only when the truth is told, and only when someone is willing to listen long enough to hear it.